Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all again, and welcome back to the Atta football events. This time, we're going to be looking at a different side of the game and life, really. So while you can watch the 90 minutes and all the highlights and awesome behind the scenes content you're not going to get anywhere else here on Atta football, there's also, and I can speak from a little bit of experience, a lot that goes on off the pitch. And one major topic that every elite athlete and human basically spends a lot of time considering is nutrition. What do we put into our bodies that we can then use as fuel, as pleasure, and as energy to support the healing and regeneration processes in our bodies? And today, we are lucky enough to have as a friend of Atta Football, Lyn-Genet Recitas, New York Times and international best-selling author, nutritionist, thyroid and weight loss expert, chef as well, and you describe yourself as a general rabble rouser. Lyn-Genet,
Pretty
welcome.
much. Hi. Thanks for having me.
I can't keep up with all your books, but your latest one is called The Metabolism Plan. That is the last one, correct?
It's no, actually that was the vegan and vegetarian cookbook, but we just released the Metabolism Plan workbook because so many people found the Metabolism Plan just a little too dense with the science. So I just made it super fun and friendly.
Nice. So what is your latest book then that's out on the shelves right now?
That's the Metabolism Plan workbook,
Gotcha.
which has like 100 new recipes. And I'm working on a new book called Tame the Flame, which is inflammation and depression. So that's pretty exciting.
That is so interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned inflammation because there are 1,000 million topics that we can discuss, having spoken to you before and read your books as well. But today I really want to focus on three things that I find super fascinating, and also what our fans are asking us to talk to you about because they know all about you and they've sent in questions. And the way you talk about nutrition and how it impacts areas of performance is really, really interesting, especially for our audience, which is, predominantly soccer and football lovers, players, coaches, etc. Can we start with inflammation? This feels like something that when I was playing was not a topic that we really discussed or even understood, but can you maybe start just with explaining what inflammation is and why it's not so great to have in our bodies?
Right. Well, we can think of inflammation as, let's say you're running and you sprain your ankle and your ankle gets inflamed. And that's actually a good thing because that means that your body is seeking to repair the injured site. But we start to have an issue when we have chronic inflammation. So chronic inflammation, what's going to wind up happening is that it's much harder for your body to repair. It's much harder for you to put on muscle. It's much harder for you to operate at peak performance. Then we also have, when we have heightened levels of progesterone or heightened levels of inflammation, we have heightened levels of cortisol. And this is really when we start to have problems because heightened levels of cortisol, our stress hormone, not only affects your mood, but it also affects your hormones. So in women, it's going to shunt progesterone production, and in men, testosterone production. And this is when it starts to get really interesting. And I'm going to hold off a little bit because I know we want to talk about hormones. And right now, we just want to deal with inflammation. So inflammation can be caused very much by diet, over exercise, stress, not enough sleep. Let's just start with there. My first book, The Plan, really addressed the foods that could cause inflammation. So what people don't realize is when you eat a food, and I'm talking healthy foods, you could eat a healthy food and it could cause an inflammatory process. And remember, if you're in a chronic state of inflammation as an athlete, you just can't perform your best and you're not going to recover from injuries. So finding the foods that work for your body is really important. For instance, for me, I can't eat a chickpea to save my life. It just kills me.
Really? What do you
Yeah,
mean it kills you? What
it
is?
kills me. So it kicks up histamine, which means it's going to kick up allergies, and other people it might kick up rosacea or joint pain or migraines. And it's also going to cause massive amounts of weight gain. So I could have 1 teaspoon of hummus and put on 1.5 pounds.
What? So I had this a friend of mine that said a similar thing about her friend who about cucumbers. That actually cucumber. Yeah, what? Tell me. Don't tell me.
Cucumbers are the devil in a red dress.
What? You can get fat from cucumbers and
Right? Yes.
okay.
Yes. And
Yeah.
this is what's so hard because remember, when you're eating that food, it's just not causing weight gain.
Right.
Like that's not that big of a deal.
Right.
But
Right.
if you're eating a healthy food and it's causing inflammation, it is affecting every single process in your body and could also be setting you up for heart disease, for cancer, for autoimmune disease, and certainly for skewed hormones.
Yeah. So that's really interesting how it affects your hormones. So how does inflammation actually affect performance, like hormones and your mood? And actually, do you know what? You have this really wonderful graphic called the inflammatory food cycle, I think. So I think it might be interesting to show that now because I think that helps to for our watchers to explain what you're talking about. But how does inflammation really affect performance specifically with the hormones and mood?
Okay, so when you eat an inflammatory food, we discussed that it's going to kick up cortisol, which is your stress hormone. We already know that when you're stressed, you're not going to be operating at your best. But when you eat an inflammatory food, it kicks up histamine. And what we measure on the plan is how much histamine your body produces in reaction to a food. So your capillaries are actually leaking fluid and it stays on as water retention.
Mm.
That kind of scares your body if you can just think about it, right? Those cucumbers are not only causing 2 pound weight gain in that histamine response, but it's kicking up cortisol, your stress hormone. When you have heightened levels of cortisol, what winds up happening in women is it generally shunts progesterone production, making you estrogen dominant.
Mhm.
When we have these fluctuating hormones of cortisol and estradiol and progesterone, what it does then is it attacks your thyroid. And this is when it gets really interesting because your thyroid, yes, it's a master gland for your metabolism, but it's also the master gland for your mood. So we've got these fluctuating hormones, you're stressed out, your metabolism is slowing down. And what winds up happening for a lot of people is, well, now you're putting on weight, right? And so what do? You cut calories and you exercise harder. But when you cut calories, that puts your body under stress. And when you exercise too intensely, that puts your body under stress. So we start going this entire negative feedback loop from cucumbers, right? Of course, there's overtraining, there's a lot of other factors, but just from the food perspective, finding the foods that work for your body and fuel you, and like you said, and also give you pleasure is really important. I don't care how
Mm.
much you like cucumbers, it's not worth it.
That's so fascinating. So, and I read that in your book. You said that everyone is eating at least three healthy foods causing inflammation. For example, cauliflower you mentioned, black beans you mentioned. So, how do you figure out what those foods are? What's the first step?
Well, certainly, when I tell people, if you ever feel bloated after a meal, if you ever feel like you have an energy dip after a meal, if you're ever gassy or you
Food
notice every
coma.
time, yeah, that's a sign that your body, you ate something that didn't agree with your body. So
Mm.
the easy route would be to take a look at the inflammatory food list that I devised. So, for instance, salmon, hard boiled eggs, cauliflower, asparagus, those are all 85% reactive, which means that for 85% of the population, these foods can cause inflammation. So you might just want to, in the first week, just eat from the lower inflammatory foods and then sort of reset your metabolism and sensitize your body. But for people that are really interested in the entire process, what I do in the beginning is based on my research, I introduce the least inflammatory foods. And then we slowly start to test the foods that you eat. And then based on your response, a physiological response and a weight response and a thyroid response, you can determine whether these foods are working for you now. You should keep them in or you should kick them to the curb.
Right. So you can do it sort of in a professional environment with you, but you can also just start from, the simple foods or the non-inflammatory foods, and then work your way and sort of see what your reaction is by yourself if you have a food coma. Okay.
Absolutely. And with athletes, it's going to be hard to find the time period where you aren't exercising so intensely so you can actually follow all 30 days of my diet.
Mm.
Generally, it takes about 45 days to get a real handle on how much exercise your body can handle, how much food, which foods you should be eating. But for a lot of people, the exercise is a huge component in raising cortisol. So I developed a very elaborate and precise protocol for you to figure out exactly what triggers cortisol to rise in you, whether it's the food, the the exercise, the sleep, or the stress. And then once you identify what does and doesn't work for your body, how to handle those variables.
So interesting. I mean, one of the things that we talk about as athletes, and that, and not even as athletes, just as, people who are taking over the counter drugs, is anti-inflammatories. And for me specifically, when I was in college, this was sort of, well, just take an anti-inflammatory, we didn't even really understand what that was. Are there any negative effects of that? Do they help with inflammation, while we're on the topic? Because I feel like it's a topic that every athlete is going to come across, whether in college or just in life.
Right. So if you're talking about an acute injury, you sprain your ankle, once again, using that. Should you take an anti-inflammatory? It's definitely an idea that's up there. But if you are taking anti-inflammatories all the time, you are putting your health at risk.
Mm.
Kidney disease, liver disease, high blood pressure, upset stomach. I mean, the list goes on. There are natural anti-inflammatories that you can use. I know a lot of European sports teams use Vobenzyme, which is a German proteolytic enzyme that eats away at inflammation.
Mm.
Boswellia is another great herb, originally from India, that can help reduce inflammation as well. But if you are finding that you are in a chronic state of inflammation, it's really important to figure out why.
Mm.
And the why is what's going to keep you the best athlete possible.
That's so interesting, because turmeric's another one that seems to always come up on the list as an anti-inflammatory. Is that true?
It is true short term, but long term, it can also pose liver risks. So it's not something
Mm.
that I recommend on a regular basis.
Okay, interesting. And then you also touched on hormones. And I think this one is fascinating, because it's a topic that is huge for all women, girls and women, everywhere, because we don't really discuss the life cycle of hormones. It's like, well, you're going to get your period at a certain age, and then you're going to go into menopause and fend for yourself for the rest of it, kind of, right? But hormones can and often do affect everything for girls and women. And it can be a massive dictator in their lives, with little information or confusing information out there. So if we just start with performance, right? Because that's where we're sort of coming from, and an elite athlete particularly, or women and girls that are looking to, become elite athletes, how would you say that hormones affect performance, and what are the things that we should be thinking about?
Well, we're actually dealing with a couple of things here. If you're looking at the standard chart for where your hormones should be at a certain point on your cycle, you could start to get some information about how your body responds. So, for instance, we discussed that high levels of cortisol will use progesterone as its fuel, which makes you estrogen dominant. When you have estrogen dominance, it actually lowers your power and your performance, and you're more at risk for ligament injury, right? So
Mm.
if you're overtraining and your body's stressed out, or if you're eating reactive foods and your body's stressed out, you are going to be estrogen dominant. Low levels of estrogen are just as problematic. Low levels of progesterone, your strength is lower, your pain is higher, right? So when you are
Mhm.
stressed out, you can see how that really affects your performance. And probably for most women, when they're starting out and they're just training and they're not overtraining and they aren't eating foods that are so reactive, you can actually look at the flow chart. So in the beginning of your cycle, estrogen starts to rise. By the time you ovulate, then progesterone starts to rise. Estrogen does another dip, another lift up, but it's not as high as progesterone. So if we were to look at these, we would say, okay, when your estrogen is high, this is how you should be training. And when your progesterone is high, this is how you should be training. But now, knowing how much foods and stress can affect your hormones, we don't really know where you are in your hormones, right? We just
Oh
don't
gosh.
know.
Oh, great.
Many,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
Throw the food in there as well as the hormone. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
and then many women find that, you mentioned that some women have the cramps are so bad when they're
Yep.
having their cycle that they can't perform. But many women find that when they're having their cycle, because the hormones are at their lowest, this is actually when they perform the best.
Yep.
So we can't say during training you should be doing strength, and other parts of training you should be doing this, because we don't know. All we know is you can identify how you perform as an athlete, and then based on that, work with your coach and start coming up with a training schedule that works for you.
Mm.
So, low progesterone can also mean that you're having poor sleep and a bad mood. Of course, that's going to affect your performance. So, understanding what hormone has its superpower, what it's responsible for, and then knowing how you respond at different times of your cycle is really important.
So would you recommend that girls do take a look at their cycle and sort of look at when they feel the strongest, the weakest, according to their cycle? Yeah. Okay. And there's lots of
Absolutely.
apps that are out there now, right?
I think really the best thing to do is to start off with blood work.
Mm.
Get blood work done a few times a year. So let's say you're in the luteal phase of your cycle,
What's a
and
luteal? Sorry.
the luteal, the latter part
Gotcha.
of your cycle. That's when progesterone should be at its highest. But if your
Mhm.
progesterone is low in relation to your estrogen, then you know that you're having problems with your progesterone. Then you can start to really work your workouts that way. If you don't have access to having your blood work done 2 to 3 to 4 times a year, then yes, certainly noting your performance at different times of your cycle is really important. But we also have to recognize that that's going to change.
Right.
When you're in off season and you're not exercising as much, your body's going to respond differently. In the beginning of your training, your hormones might be completely balanced, but by the time you're 3 months in, you might be responding completely differently. So the
Mm.
best thing that you can do is just track your own performance. Once again, share it with your teammates, share it with your coach, and then base everything around that.
Yeah. And I mean, we do often do that, share how we're feeling based on our, menstrual cycle with our teammates, for better or worse. But no, it's great advice. I think it's just nice to know where do you even start if you have access to certain things or if you don't. You mentioned stress and stress affecting hormones. So how, if you have high stress levels, how does that affect your hormones?
Right. So in men, it's going to shunt testosterone production, and for most women, it's going to make them estrogen dominant.
Mhm.
Remember that estrogen dominance is a real problem when it comes to power and performance. So even if the progesterone is supposed to be low, but the estrogen is still high, you can have that estrogen dominance. So the identifying what causes cortisol to rise in us is really important.
Mm.
Of course, there's just the stress of everyday life. There's the stress of being an athlete. There's the stress of eating reactive foods. There's the stress of not getting enough sleep, the stress of overtraining. Once you identify how your body responds to these varying stimuli, there are tools that you can use. So, for instance, when I'm working with marathoners, for example, we'll just test them at 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, and see how their body responds using their thyroid as an indicator.
Mm.
If we find out that they always bonk after 10 miles,
Yeah.
what I do is I introduce adaptogens and certain supplements to help offset the rise in cortisol. But I don't have them do it on a daily basis, just when they train over 10 miles, because we know that's when it's bad for you. I'm not a big proponent of taking supplements on a regular basis, but I do believe that they're an incredible catalyst and tool for your best health. So once again, understanding and identifying what works for you is important. When we're talking about the use of adaptogens in sports, and certainly this has been going on, I mean, Russia's been using it for forever.
Yeah.
Um,
Wait, sorry, can you just define adaptogens for those of us
so,
who don't
yes,
know what
so
adaptogens is?
adaptogens might be stuff like ashwagandha. You see ashwagandha mentioned a lot, rhodiola, ginseng. These are all herbs that adapt your body. They help your body adapt to stress.
Hmm.
And you can use these really systematically and really smartly. But the problem I find with most formulations nowadays is they're throwing the whole thing in,
Yeah.
the whole kitchen sink, right? It's the
Yes.
turmeric and it's everything.
Uh-huh.
And you really need to be smart. And once again, identify how your body responds to stress. And then once you understand that, plugging in the appropriate adaptogen or supplement. So, for instance, one of my favorite supplements, and I mention in all my books, is SAMe. And what SAMe does is it helps to boost serotonin or dopamine. Those are your
Mhm.
I'm happy neurotransmitters, so that it
Right.
offsets the effects of cortisol. This is really important. So if you're that runner and you know you're going to go for that 15-mile run, then that would be a day you take SAMe. And the days you just do a recovery run, you don't.
Hmm. Yeah, really interesting because I remember in college and then even after in my professional career, just getting given all kinds of tubs of supplements and nutrients that we were supposed to take. And sort of the buzz ones were the metabolism, the magnesium and the calcium, obviously, and then all different kinds of other things. So, and also nowadays I have like a green powder that just has everything in it, which clearly you're telling me is maybe not the best green powder to be having. But that's really interesting. So, in terms of supplements and just starting with, how they affect your hormones and introducing them into your diet, how would you recommend starting that process for, let's say, people who don't have access to the types of testing that you're doing with your marathon runners?
Right. Well, actually, the testing is incredibly easy. Anybody
Mm,
can do it. It's outlined in all of my books. So people don't even need to work with me. I'm
fab.
literally giving you the tools every single day to assess how your body responds to varying stimuli, which is exciting. I mean, the book
Yeah.
has helped millions of people
Yeah.
really identify what causes stress in them. But it's funny you bring up the green drink. Those can be a real mess
Mm,
because it can contain a lot of compounds known as goitrogens. And what goitrogens do is they attack thyroid function, and that's going to disrupt your hormones as well. So, and also, what if you're reactive to the cauliflower or to the asparagus or to whatever's
right.
in there, right? And you're taking this on a daily basis, you could actually be doing more harm than good. So, when it comes to supplements, I try to keep it really simple. And I do believe that food is your medicine. And if you have a balanced diet, you don't really need to take supplements. Once again, if I'm sick, I'm going to take zinc that day 3 to 4 times, and then I put it back in the fridge. And
Right.
that's why I believe supplements should be used. People often come to me with, a whole laundry list. Oh, my doctor says I'm deficient in this and deficient in this. And they bring me like
Yeah.
$500 worth of supplements. And I say, look, I want you to throw it all out, put it away. We can get your blood work redone in 6 weeks. And sure enough, almost all of those nutritional deficiencies are balanced. Because what's really wonderful is when you test foods, the ones that we call your friendly foods,
Yeah.
are actually used to balance nutritional deficiencies. So if you are low in selenium and iodine, then something like scallops might be your friendliest protein. If you are deficient in iron, zinc, and B12, something like lamb or steak is going to work better for you.
Mm,
Now, what is interesting is after a time, when these nutritional deficiencies are met and you have enough iron and zinc, and now your body needs selenium, now beef is not going to be as friendly for you, and now you need the scallops. So rather than having elaborate testing and spending all this money, which is just a huge waste of time and also highly inaccurate when it comes to food testing, what you can do is just follow this simple 30-day plan that I developed that'll allow you to test the foods that work for your body and the exercise that works for your body.
and that is exactly the third topic that I want to talk to you about was diet, because exactly how you said, there's a lot of fads going on. There's talk about the different type of blood type. That's the type of food that you should be eating for that blue blood type. There's, the hot topics and the fads like vegan. And I'm not saying that's just a fad, but all these different things. And I think it's really hard, especially for younger people coming through who haven't had that much time to try different foods or work with different diets to figure out what diets really work for us. So you're saying to start off to figure out what diet works for us is to go on this 30-day plan and start testing food that is in there to begin with. Is that the sort of starting point that you would recommend?
Absolutely. And it's much more accurate than any food allergy testing. So, the most accurate food allergy testing is going to be about 50 to 60% accurate. I certainly have had clients come to me with, blood work done all within a couple of weeks of each other, and they all say different things. There might be a couple of things
Wow.
overlapping, but one will say, "Oh, this is highly inflammatory for you," and another one will say, "This is absolutely the food you should be eating." So, one, we're talking about the high cost and it being highly inaccurate. And of course, as athletes, what you're trying to do is, as quickly as possible, ascertain what's working for you. And you are regimented. You are going to do what you need to do. And if it's not accurate information, you could be screwing up your hormones and
Mm-hmm.
causing inflammation. When you bring up the blood type, diet. He did a very small sample, and it was pretty much one sample area. Whereas the work that we do, we work with people all over the world and collect data. So I might work differently, say, with somebody in India that has different genetics than somebody in the UK. But there is always an overlap. And once again, how I said foods can be rotated in and out based on nutritional deficiencies. The blood type diet just doesn't bring that into account. What's going to work for
Mm,
you in your teens is going to be different in your 30s, 40s, and 50s.
that's
So,
interesting.
yeah, absolutely.
That's really interesting, sort of how your body develops over the years. So not only you're saying genetics plays a part of it, so where you're from and what your body is actually composed of, as well as your age and how I guess your hormones are affecting, the metabolism in your body and the way that your body is processing different things. That's really interesting. How big a part does genetics play in choosing a diet?
Okay, so when we're talking about genetics and we're talking about race, the whole genome testing when it comes to testing foods is maybe in 20 years it'll be accurate and it'll give you some information, but right now
Wow.
it's just a complete waste of time. But when we
Wow.
are, oh yeah, oh yeah. But when we are talking about race and ethnicity, this is when it gets pretty interesting. For instance, only 14% of Northern Europeans have the genetics to be a successful vegetarian, whereas people of African and Asian descent are closer to 50 to 70%. Right. So when we're reading a book like the China study, which was done on Asian people and they fed them lots of meat, well, of course they're going to get cancer. They just don't have the genetics to have a high meat diet. Then there's also could be the foods that you eat as part of your diet might actually be foods that you're reactive to. So, for
Right.
instance, the highest level of sesame allergies are with Middle Eastern people because it's such a prevalent part of their diet, the way peanuts could be in the American diet. So,
Right.
you do want to have a basic knowledge of that. We also have to bring into account that when you're younger, you are at your digestive peak. Stress can lower that ability to digest food properly. But the foods and the diets that work for you in your teens might be different in your 20s when you start to lose digestive enzymes and stomach acid and saliva. And as an athlete, this can be incredibly frustrating because you're like, I don't understand. This
Yeah.
worked for me when I was 18 and now I'm 25 and it's not. And I'm trying my hardest. So we beat ourselves up more. And we, once again, start going in that let's cut calories, which
Right.
slows your metabolism,
Mhm.
and let's over exercise, which affects your hormones and raises cortisol.
So fascinating. And let's talk about vegan diets because I think this is really interesting because you just said that some chickpeas have a really bad effect on you and cucumbers on another. And so taking away the ethical part of the animal lover part, the discussion completely aside, and just breaking it down strictly from a diet standpoint, do vegan diets work for everyone?
It can be very hard because we're talking about everyone needing a certain level of protein, but when we're talking athletes, it's much higher.
Mhm.
Because we're limiting the amount of proteins that we can actually use and ones that have the right amino acid profile so they can actually combine together to make a complete protein, it can be really hard. That being said, are there successful vegan athletes? Absolutely. I did write my fourth book, the Vegan and Vegetarian Cookbook, because by the time people came to me, I saw so many nutritional deficiencies, thyroid issues, hair falling out, weight gain,
Mm.
skewed hormones, migraines, joint pain, autoimmune disease. But you do have to almost be a scientist and a chemist to really keep on top to make sure you're getting enough protein. And many of these manufactured proteins are just really toxic crap.
Mm.
So, could you try some protein powders? Maybe, but if you're having peas every day, you're going to build up an intolerance to peas, and now that food is going to be inflammatory. One of the big concepts behind my work is the rotator react principle, and every food has a maximum amount of time that should be in your diet. So, for instance, spinach is pretty cool. Its amino acid profile is 120, and a cup of cooked spinach has 5 grams of protein, which is not
Mm.
bad, and pretty
Yeah.
good calcium and pretty good iron. But if you eat spinach every single day, you are definitely going to build up a spinach sensitivity. And because spinach more than once a week will attack your thyroid, you're also going to be slowing your metabolism and causing inflammation. Athletes are willing to put in the work to figure out what it is that they need to do. The problem is that the correct information is not out there, and
Mm.
you kind of have to sift and shut through all this kind of stuff. So rather than, looking to TikTok and what some star in Hollywood is doing, you really have to start looking to the best nutritionist and really the best personal trainer, which is you, because nobody knows your body better than you. And if you have the tools to understand what works for your body, you can just keep going and going and going and getting stronger and better and faster and more balanced and in a better mood too.
And this is exactly what feels like the theme of this entire talk is really that you have to take ownership of your own body, your own diet, and be more aware of how you're reacting to the things that you're putting into your body, and that may change over time. And what you're reading or what others are doing doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for yourself. So it's so fascinating. What about fasting? This intermittent fasting.
So when you cut calories, what you do is, okay, I want you to think when we were hunters and gatherers, there would be periods where there would be droughts and famine and long, hard, cold winters, and we just didn't have enough food. And when that would happen, what your body would do is an amazing thing to keep us alive. It would start to slow your metabolism, which would mean it also slow your body's ability to heal. So if you just fast for one day, you're not going to enact this biological process that kept us alive. But if you're doing it on a regular basis, and if you're not getting enough calories, what you are going to do is slow your metabolism.
Mm.
So can you do intermittent fasting successfully? Absolutely. But you're going to need to make sure that one, you're getting the right nutrients, and two, you're getting enough calories during the time period when you are eating, which once again, is it a lot of work? Yeah. Can it be done? Absolutely. But you really have to be on top of your nutrition, know your caloric need, make sure you're getting all the fuel for your body. Because
Yeah.
if you are doing this, once again, we're talking about estrogen dominance. Estrogen is really responsible for ligaments. So when we're talking about all those ACL injuries, is it
Right.
due to estrogen dominance? Probably,
So interesting.
So
Because there are some studies that link sort of where you are in your menstrual cycle, and when you actually are on your period, you're menstruating, that there's a higher risk of ACL tear. That was a few. So that makes sense to me. As you're saying that with the where you are on your hormones. What about cravings? So I always crave salty things, and my best friend just wants chocolate all the time. What's that
okay.
about?
Well, salt is very interesting.
Hmm.
If we're looking that it's just a physiological response, a lot of times with endocrine issues, adrenal burnout, people that they're under more stress will crave salt, kind of balances it off. But also the more salt that we have, the more salt that we crave. So we kind of, our palate deadens. So that's why in the first 3 days of the plan, we cut out all salt completely.
Oh.
And people are shocked by how salty foods taste once we introduce salt again on day 4. It does a whole reset of your palate. But the more salt that you crave, also the more carbohydrates and sugar you might be craving as well. So we start to really, I'm not saying salt is essential, sodium is an essential electrolyte, but we do have to watch out how much we're having and what form of salt that we're getting.
Right. So like French fries and potato chips, they're fine, right? Like that's
Absolutely.
fine, right? Thanks.
No, I'm
That's all I need.
serious.
You don't even, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yes. No, no, yes, go ahead, please. Yes.
So French, if you fry a potato, and
Mhm.
once again, a potato is a great vegan source of protein and potassium, another essential electrolyte. When you fry potatoes in a good oil, you actually increase the antioxidant capacity, which means that French fries are healthier for you than a baked potato. Um, Potato chips are super interesting because they have an ounce of potato chips has as much potassium as a banana, but none of the sugar and starch. So yes,
Right.
potato chips are actually part of the diet.
Fabulous. We love this diet. The more you discuss this diet, Lyn-Genet, the more I'm buying into it. I'm not gonna lie. I have a gazillion other questions, but we're going to have to take some time because our really cool community at Ata Football sent us a lot of questions. We tried to incorporate some of it already, but they definitely haven't disappointed with the interest that they have in these. So, may I ask you some of our fan questions? And
Absolutely.
yes, fab. Okay, the first one would be how and if you're supposed to adjust your diet on off days. So when you're, like you said, you're training quite a lot and then you have an off day, Monday, you get a down day, or days with lower activity, and or when you're injured. Really good
Right.
question.
So when you're on your off days, it really depends on what level you're exercising at. If you're just a casual exerciser and you're exercising for 45 minutes a day, 3 to 4 times a week, and you take a day off, you're really not going to change your diet that much. I do find that on the days that you start exercising intensely, you are going to need either more protein and or more grain carbohydrates or both. So a lot is really at what level you're competing at. And in the metabolism plan workbook, we start to say over 45 minutes, you start to, once you have the foundational foods that work for your body, you start to test to see which works better for you, more grain carbohydrates or more protein. So if you're working out, let's say it's the middle of your season and you're taking a day off, I don't want you to change your diet on your day off. However, if you were taking 3 months off, then yes, you might need to change your diet. You might need to decrease your protein. You might to decrease your grain carbohydrates. You might need to include more foods that are healing and beneficial. So those would be the foods that are rich in potassium and magnesium, super
Right.
important.
Like
Yeah,
potato
so
chips you
that's
just mentioned, right?
potato. There you go.
Yes. Taking notes. I'm taking notes.
You're a quick learner.
Eat more potato chips, guys. Okay. No, it's really, really good because I had, through my career, you have some times where you're just training a little bit less and you sort of don't realize that you're changing your diet. And then I had like big chunks of my career where I was really injured and I was, on crutches. And I actually noticed that I lost weight during those times. I think a lot of it was probably the muscle mass as well. But yeah, I just think it's a really interesting topic because then you have to gain that weight back in a positive way as well, which I'm imagining that you deal with some clients that need weight gain as well as weight loss.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And a
go ahead.
lot of it is for women, I find, especially when you're talking about weight and not wanting to lose the muscle,
Mm,
women tend to retain, I don't want to say retain a lot more. When they exercise intensely with lower body exercises, it is easier to maintain the weight. And if you aren't doing that, it is harder to maintain the weight. So that's something to think about.
mm.
A lot of times when I'm working with cyclists, if they take a month off, they will automatically lose 10 pounds without doing any change in their diet, still eating as much. So it really depends on what your goals are.
Yeah, super interesting. Um, Another good question from a fan is what are some signs of nutritional performance related issues? And that's really good because, you're talking about looking at your own body and trying to calibrate yourself, how you're reacting. But what really should we be looking for?
That's a great question. So much is going to be, are you getting injured frequently?
Mm,
How's your performance? Are you feeling tired? Are you feeling when you're training, you're just not into it? Um, do you have headaches? Do you have joint pain? Are your cycles super heavy? Are there hormonal imbalances? You're not getting your cycle at all. These are all some of the things that can be affecting us. But food is really responsible for your performance, for your mood, for optimized hormones, and for optimized metabolism. And if any of those are off, it's time to start looking at your diet and see what needs tweaking. Because as you said, in your teens and 20s, every person I've met is eating 3 healthy foods that are causing inflammation. But by the time you're in your 30s, it's 5 foods. And by the time you're in your 40s, it could be 8 foods because you
wow.
haven't identified and taken out the foods that are annoying your body. Thereby, you're increasing the inflammation. The more inflammation there is in your body, the harder it is for you to be an elite athlete.
Or just like a happy human being, it sounds like as well, right? Like, okay, so fascinating. Okay, this one we kind of already touched on because you talked about supplements, but this was a really interesting question, and maybe there's a generic answer to that. Are there specific supplements that you recommend for female athletes that are training for hours daily? And I know you mentioned you should look and tweak, but is there anything where it's like, yeah, you need magnesium or anything?
Well, like I said, I do believe you can get most of it through your diet. The
Right.
problem with training is when your body perceives exercise as stress instead of fun. And that happens to everyone. And it's finding out where that point is for you. Then we need to identify, okay, I can train Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but by the time it comes Thursday, my body is bonking. What are the symptoms I am showing? That's how we would choose what adaptogen or what supplement we need.
Mm.
So if on Thursday when I start to train I have anxiety, I might suggest you take an herb called lemon balm, because lemon balm is it's in the mint family. I grow it in my garden.
Mhm.
You can have a tea of it, but it helps with anxiety and it also helps with sleep. So we'll find that when you have those heightened levels of anxiety, that you're also having sleep issues. This is super important because when you're sleeping is when your body's doing the optimal repair. So
Right.
having that sleep is essential. But if for somebody else you find that it's really affecting your hormones on Thursday, you're just in a really crappy mood and you're irritable, then maybe something like ginseng might work better.
Mhm.
So knowing what superpower there is for each of these supplements that are specifically used for athletes is really important. And then once again, identifying what works for you. And it might be testing. One week you might test ashwagandha, and the next week rhodiola, and the next week ginseng, and see what works better for your body. The good news is these are not expensive supplements. They don't need to be. And I think too many people are thinking that they need to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to optimize their performance. And you don't. And I know because I'm cheap. I don't like spending a lot of money, but you can do all of this for like $30 or $40 a month. And that's really not that much. If it's preventing injury and it's making you a better athlete, this is really important.
Uh, Lyn-Genet, so it feels like throughout this whole conversation, it really is about understanding your own body and looking at the things that affect you and how things affect you and updating your behaviors according to you personally, right?
Absolutely. So much of the research, and I'm sure everyone knows, there really wasn't much research on female athletes. And when it was done by men. So there just isn't enough data compiled. And that's why I think you figuring out we're actually laying the groundwork for future female athletes, and we're sort of creating our own anecdotal research now. It's really important. The answers are not out there, but we can find them.
So good. I have 1,000 more questions. This could literally be a whole series, which we might actually do. So hang tight, watch this space. But Lyn-Genet Recitas, how amazing are you? My mind is literally blown. Chickpeas and cucumbers. What? Well, we hope and know, I'm sure that this has been helpful for everyone out there. Lynn, we can follow you on Instagram and Twitter, and you have many, many books out there, like you said, and meal plans and recipe books. If you guys want any more info on any and all of this. But for now, I'm going to sign off and say thank you so much for joining us today. And we really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. You're fantastic. It's just so interesting. Thank you so much. See you guys next time.
Absolutely.